All for coming. So I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Shannon LaDeau. I'm a scientist here at Cary, and all of my pertinent information's on the web. We had a hole in the seminar series, and we are trying to get Cary scientists to talk as part of the seminar series. And so I am here to share my research, which I realize I haven't done in the seminar series since I interviewed for a job. And then I will be righteously engaged in signing up other people for next semester. So thank you all for coming. I decided I was going to do something different than give my kind of standard polished talk and try to walk you all through my thought processing and how I am working over the past year to kind of synthesize a bunch of research in a complex socioecological system and think about the general nature of that specific system kind of in a disease ecology context. So I'm just going to get going and I promise I will stop on time, but I have not given this to the public. So the talk's going to kind of follow the progression of my work since I came to Cary. And to begin that, I found it kind of interesting, given recent-ish events, to look back at kind of what got me into thinking about what I now know as disease ecology, but these kind of complex tritrophic systems where multiple things have to come together for a specific outcome. And so in 1999, there was a lot of hoopla about a new virus that was killing birds, various collections at zoos, but also large birds that happen to live near where people are and were falling in the street, so crows, blue jays. And it was identified as West Nile virus eventually when both the zoo collections and enough humans in the New York City region became ill, and the testing was followed through on. But it was a big mystery. New York was all over it. Some 8 people died. On the order of 60s were ill and documented. And it was an initial glimpse at how ill-prepared public health and veterinary health were to work together and understand a zoonotic emergence. We don't see things like this that often. It was a pretty big deal, partially because this is a really complex ecological system. A lot of things are introduced all the time, and they just don't make it through all the filters. And in this case, the filters engage multiple trophic levels, and so you've got hosts that okay, so you've got reservoirs or hosts where the virus infects them. You've got vectors that pick it up when they bite those hosts, and then you've got spillover into humans. So again, this is a complex tritrophic system. There are environmental habitat and abiotic filters at each of these levels. And there's interdependency, so things that happen at one level don't necessarily have predictable effects on what might happen at another level, right? So a complex system, you can understand all the pairwise interactions, and yet you still might not be able to predict a particular outcome of interest. So it's a really cool system, really complex system. Amplification occurs if an infected vertebrate host is bitten by mosquitoes and infected. If it's competent, so that means the virus can survive inside that vertebrate host and replicate. And the host itself has to survive long enough for that to happen. And then it has to be bitten again by a mosquito. And the mosquito vector has to bite the right host, has to survive for up to a week, 6 or more days for the virus to replicate inside the mosquito. And then it has to be competent, meaning the virus replicates and goes back to the salivary glands, and it has to bite a competent host again. Okay, so these things are easy biology to track in the lab and to follow, but each of them in turn, happening sequentially, is a series of unlikely events. It's also important to note that the viral replication is also temperature dependent, and so if even the right species come into contact at the wrong time of year, if it's too cold, you would expect the end of that transmission cycle. Spillover, so this is how it builds up in the environment. Spillover is when a mosquito happens to bite an infected host and then bite a human. The mosquito still has to survive for that 6 days. The virus still has to replicate in the mosquito. And then something that spent most of its time looking for a bird has to choose to bite a human next. Okay, again, unlikely series of events. Each of the single or univariate interactions is somewhat simple to see how you might line them up, but to get them all to line up in the field is unlikely. And so the fact that it did with West Nile virus emerging in the US in 1999 was probably not something that could have been predicted with great certainty or any certainty. And no matter how much we learn, it's hard to know how predictable it becomes. But at the time, I put this up here. This was the CDC media release in October of that year. And I liked that they ensured everyone that all current control and prevention measures are the measures that should be taken. I found that very comforting. And a hard freeze will significantly reduce mosquito activity for this season. Again, when we're thinking about single interactions or about, even about this picture, it's easy to think about control options that should interrupt this cycle, especially when you think about the unlikely nature of all of those things lining up. Any mosquito control should have some effect, right? Like it's easy to see how humans might interrupt this place here, so you remove the mosquitoes that are trying to bite humans, or it could even try to interrupt here by reducing the mosquitoes that bite birds. So given the complexity built into the ecological system and a certain belief in the western and temperate zones' superiority, I think there was a lot of overconfidence that West Nile virus would not be a continuing issue after the winter of '99. So here is a series of maps I'm going to show. This is 1999. Blue is non-human West Nile virus activity, so that's those mosquitoes and birds. Red is human cases. There are a ton of problems with trying to monitor disease through human cases, zoonotic diseases through human cases that I'm not going to go into, but you can see that in 1999, there was some kind of widespread New Jersey, New York, some of Connecticut, animal illness and West Nile virus human cases. 2000, not only did it not go away in 99, but it spread. 2002, 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 years for a complicated ecological system to find a foothold across the entire continent. So this is what kind of got me into thinking about disease ecology. I was trained as a community ecologist, so now I think about community ecology in terms of things that cause disease, and this was an incredible data set to do that. Turns out the data were not what I had hoped, but the ecological and epidemiological opportunities here are pretty amazing. So again, we've got the blue are the non-human, the red is the human. This is a complex system of interactions, and it was able to be repeated across the entire continent, so across all kinds of different ecological regions, which is really cool. There's a lot to be unpacked there. So why was that able to happen? And so now we're going to dig in. The way I entered into this world was thinking about the impact on birds and trying to understand whether or not the passivist surveillance of these dead birds that people found was actually a signal of West Nile virus intensity in bird populations more broadly? Or is it just big birds die where people see them? These are passive surveillance. People find them. People weren't going out testing wild birds with any design. Sentinel birds were put out. So if you put out chickens, do they get infected in an area? And mosquito pool testing. A lot of it was set up after the fact. West Nile virus was already present, and not for ecological reasons. However, there is this amazing data set, the Breeding Bird Survey, that's been around for 100 years. All of these red dots are actually these routes that are driven every June by people who have way more bird skills than I do, and they count all the birds they encounter on those routes every June. So this is a live bird survey with incredible spatial and temporal depth. And during my postdoc, I spent a lot of time with that data set. And the first thing we did was, with my collaborator at the Migratory Bird Center at the National Zoo, was look at which birds are dying. And can we use this bird survey to understand which birds are dying? And so this is a one-to-one line. This is after West Nile virus. This is before West Nile virus. These are, they're abbreviated for, like, this is Eastern towhee, this is American crow. And you can see things that fall beneath the one-to-one line had a decline in their population trajectory after West Nile virus. There's nothing about infection here. This is purely looking at the data that exists to try to understand something about mortality after West Nile virus had come into a region. and so we had all of these sites. We could look for the crows, which we know had this huge trajectory change, and were honestly the things most people were seeing in places that were dead, and build a model that could account for a whole bunch of different things. I'm not going to go into the modeling in this talk, to come up with a population model for a given site or region, and I start with the site, and then things were grouped in the model hierarchically through regions. And you fit the model to the data, which are the black dots, and stop fitting the model to any data. Only use data before West Nile virus was documented in a county. Okay, so I showed you that map. You know that, so that date is going to be different here than it is over here. You can then add the data back in, right? So then you validate it with the real data set that extends past that. And if it's outside of the 95% credible interval, we documented those as positive West Nile virus declines. Significant declines after West Nile virus was in the county. And you can actually do that for American crow, and this dashed line is that moving bar of when West Nile virus showed up. And you can see that American crow across the continent declines after West Nile virus moves in. And so that was a powerful way to suggest that American crows were a good signal of West Nile virus intensity. And in fact, if you layer those human data back on it, it does line up with the human intensity as well. But when we redid the model and fit a full model that had abiotic and biotic factors driving the population in addition to West Nile virus showing up, you start to see that of all the sites that have crows, the ones where the crow declines were the most intense were actually spatially clustered. And they're spatially clustered around, what to those of us who live in the area probably recognize as the I-95 corridor and Syracuse. So there seems to be a focus of West Nile virus mortality in crows in more urban areas. Again, crows are at all of these sites, but we see the significant post-West Nile virus declines at these sites. So there's a couple of different ways you could go with that, but I think looking at why urban areas, and I'm talking broadly about kind of bigger urban regions, might influence this system. And I think the first thing that comes to mind is that we know that there's an urban homogenization. We know that biodiversity loss, as you urbanize any system, and biodiversity introductions by humans in a system mean that cities across this whole region and urban regions across this whole region are a lot more similar than the more rural or non-urban landscapes that they're dropped into. And so it makes sense that there is an urban nature to this system that facilitated West Nile virus establishment and spread across the continent. Another way you could take this, another hypothesis for what's going on here that I'm not going to look into because it is not my skill set, is there's something about the urban system that makes a crow more immunocompromised, more susceptible to West Nile virus infection and mortality. There's lots of reasons to think that that's probably true too. It's not what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus on that vector component. So the host-vector contact has to happen for West Nile virus amplification, and the vector-human contact has to happen for any spillover. And so I'm going to focus in on understanding the mechanisms by which this system functions in an urban landscape, an urbanizing landscape across the continent. And I'm still talking about West Nile virus, but this is relevant to many. This could be agnostic in what virus you care about. The zoonotic nature of the interactions is really the focus. So it's well known that habitat influences who's there and how many. And I'm going to start to build a conceptual model that kind of is going to grow with the research to represent at each stage kind of the best current understanding that I and my collaborators have had of the system. And it's going to increasingly emphasize the multiple domains or systems at play. So we're going to start with this vector system, and you know that land use, in this case kind of urban landscape, influences habitat. That has an influence on who is there, what species, and it influences how many are there. And who's there also influences how many are there, right? So you have both the kind of abiotic filters and you have the biotic filters that control the community composition in a location. And here we're talking about vector communities, and specifically I'm talking about mosquito communities. So mosquito ecology is really interesting in urban areas. For a long time in the US in temperate regions, paving the urban area was incredibly effective at removing mosquito risk. Mosquitoes don't necessarily have a lot of habitat in a place that looks like this. Mosquitoes come from places that look more like this, and they require plants and they require water at all in order to complete their life cycle. So mosquitoes have these aquatic habitat stages that are actually the predominant time spent in their life, and that is when most of the interactions happen that determine the function and fitness and composition of who gets out as an adult. The terrestrial habitat as an adult, what they need is they're ectotherms, right? So they need to not dry out and be overheated. But for resources, they need plant nectar. Males only feed on plant nectar and pollen, and blood. And so they take a blood meal in order to complete their reproductive life cycle. And we are going to focus in first on the larvae, and I'm going to talk a lot about the larvae, even though people really care a lot more about the adults, because the larvae do not bite. The competition and resource acquisition that happens at this stage really does have profound effects on the species composition and abundance at this stage that we care about. And increasingly, we're understanding that it probably also has some pretty important impacts on the vector competence and fitness of adults at that stage. So I'm going to assume people here are familiar with the Baltimore LTR. I was lucky enough to start at Cary and start working at the Baltimore LTR, and initially paired sampling. I was horrified to find that there was no breeding birds mosquito data. And so I had to actually collect my own data when I started thinking about the vectors, and we just paired them with the LTR sites that went from the city out to the county, sampling for larvae in existing habitat. So that habitat could change and be different across these sites, and it did. But in general, the summary in rural areas, which I'm calling the county, and none of this is like, you know, the middle of nowhere, but pretty well forested and older forested areas, you would find a ton of predators, frogs, dragonfly larvae, salamander, and a reduced population of a bunch of different species. And these are genera, but so culex are a couple species, Aedes are a few species, other is a bunch of species. And in the urban areas, you would find very few predators at the sites, even if it was a stormwater pond, tons of Aedes and still more culex than in the rural sites. And the species composition of the Aedes and the culex were really simplified. So predominantly you would find culex pipiens and the related species that are known to be bird feeders, ornithophilic. They were in the kind of northeast, they were the suspected culprit of West Nile virus amplification. They breed in ditches and kind of like dirty water, and they tend to feed on birds. You also, we would get this red was predominantly Aedes albopictus, which is an invasive that came from Asia, entire imports in the 80s. In its native range, it would breed in these bamboo shoots, so tiny little tree holes, and it does really well in urban areas, and it would have fed on small mammals. So those are kind of the pre-existing knowledge. And the other category that we find in the rural sites includes a whole bunch of different species, including things like Culex territans, which only feed on frogs and amphibians. And we also found that there was real phenology evident in the rural sites that we didn't see in the urban sites. So in the rural sites, you would get this spring Aedes, then you would get Culex, and then you would get the territans building up as the frogs kind of got bigger and came out. In the urban areas, the Aedes would kind of come early and then they would stay forever. And the Culex bump came, there was this other bump, and the Culex kind of took a little longer to grow and stayed much later. So you're getting these species much later in the season. And I highlight this yellow part because this is when humans get infected with West Nile virus. And so you can already start to see that the phenology shifts as you move into the city are much more consistent with what you would expect if you're going to have spillover of West Nile virus. So we also found, and this is work by the first student I worked with through University of Maryland, that, and she did work through DC and Baltimore, that if you looked at kind of different urban neighborhoods, the types of container habitats you found where you could find mosquitoes really differed by the what she called socioeconomic status. And so she was doing this based just on income. And the light color here, which is at the top, is this disused category, which is kind of the fancy word for trash. And so you get much more containers that are disused, a higher proportion in lower income, and it kind of declines as you go up. But there's variation to the habitat type just based on the structural and stuff that people put out in their yards. And so that really started this focus on where we went back into Baltimore specifically, identified neighborhoods that were above, below, and at the neighborhood median household income. So they're in West Baltimore, and you can see we've got the median, the below, and the above, and then we focused in at the block level. And this is the work of a bunch of different people. This was a huge team and has grown over the years to involve a lot of students and my lab manager for a long time, Heather Goodman. But I'll point out Paul Leisman and Don Beeler, who have been kind of with me through the whole thing, and we've really worked well together, thinking through the social and ecological aspects of this system. And Baltimore is really nice because I've never worked in the forest and had such great plots. The plots are all really well designated. You can get these maps online. And so we had a block structure. And so when I say block, I'm referring to this collection of homes. And all of the blocks that we're working in are row homes like this, and so they have very similar structure. We did over 500 household surveys. We sampled juvenile mosquitoes from all existing habitat in 1,400 parcels every year. And we looked at adult mosquitoes on a subset of the blocks every third week for 3 of the years. And West Nile virus infection, I'm going to come back to. This is a student I've worked with, Sarah Rothman, for a while. We did a survey. This was 2015 and 16 data looking at the proportion of mosquito pools tested from those blocks that were positive for West Nile virus. Culex is what you would expect to see positive because of the bird feeding behavior. And you can see we do get about 15% positive kind of. And it's not all that different across the different income categories. There weren't a ton of Culex. We don't collect as high numbers. But Aedes albopictus was a surprise. We get fairly decent positivity in Aedes albopictus. It seems to decrease as you get into the higher income neighborhoods. And in fact, we find that there are more female Aedes albopictus in the low-income neighborhoods. This is about 3 times as many at its peak than in the higher income neighborhoods. This is summarized across all the years. Median is here in this gray. I don't put a line in there because median is absolutely all over the place, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But you see that there's definitely a socioeconomic association with where the mosquitoes are. And we're focusing in on the mosquitoes that should be relevant to West Nile virus. Eliza Little did this work looking at the number of abandoned buildings. These are the neighborhoods, and they're arranged from our lowest income to the highest income. And you can see that there's definitely an association with the proportion of abandonment by neighborhood. That is associated with the number of dump sites in the neighborhood. And vegetation turned out to be more interesting than we thought because it's relatively high. It's 20% or higher across all our neighborhoods, but it's highest in both the low and the high income neighborhoods. And Danielle Bodner's work showed that those dump sites were associated with garbage kind of throughout the neighborhood. So a block that had more dump sites also had more garbage hanging around per yard. And these are Aedes albopictus females. This axis is the larval count per yard for the discarded, those trash containers. And she found that there was a significant positive correlation between the number of trash containers in a yard and the block level abundance of female or host-seeking, biting female Aedes albopictus on that block. And so we could see block level structure that was definitely being impacted by that infrastructure component. And Eliza went on to show that it wasn't just the infrastructure, it was the infrastructure's influence on the environment, the environmental drivers, right? So if I wanted to model mosquitoes in the forest, I'd want to know how often does it rain and what falls into the habitat, how quickly can they get out. In the city, precipitation actually was differentially important depending on that infrastructure, depending on the abandonment. So if there's more abandonment, precipitation was a more positive predictor of the number of mosquitoes than it was if there was no abandonment. And if there was more abandonment, more vegetation cover was a positive predictor. If you were in a wealthy neighborhood with no abandonment, more vegetation cover was a negative predictor. So we're digging down now into the habitat. What does it mean to be in a block that has a lot of abandonment and vegetation or no vegetation? So here are 2 blocks from our work. I've got them next to each other. They're not actually next to each other. They're about 1 kilometer apart. But they look kind of similar from the top, right? Like vegetation looks pretty similar. The row home structure looks relatively similar. But when you drill down, trees in different types of neighborhoods are doing different things. They're there for different reasons. This neighborhood, you look at this alley right here, and there's trees that are in fenced yards, there's potted plants, and there's lots of people who have put in rain gutters. And honestly, it only takes 1 rain gutter. They never keep the filter up. If you drill down in that other neighborhood, again, we've got really nice tree canopy, but if you drill down, the trees are behind the abandoned buildings. They're not in people's yards. Somebody lives here, but this and this, if you can tell from this picture, they're missing their roof, right? And so the trees sometimes are growing right out of those homes, and they're associated with them. And then under the tree, you get the semi-permanent dump sites. And again, this is part of Sarah's thesis. She went back to see what are the actual species of trees and leaves that are falling into the habitats across this range of different types of neighborhoods. And she found that on average, each parcel has about 2 trees, so she focused in on getting 2 for the groups. The most common trees she found across, just by frequency, across the higher income neighborhoods were elm and maple. And across the lower income neighborhoods were Princess Tree and Tree of Heaven, so that's Ailanthus and Paulownia. And then regionally, she saw very common white mulberry and black walnut. This coloration here is trees that are not native to the area. And so it's of note that in the low income, the most frequent trees are non-native. And so she wanted to look at what happens if you rear mosquitoes in these different detrital, and this experiment has been going on, and we're just barely kind of starting to unpack it. So this is albopictus. Here it's got the stripes. This is Culex pipiens. This is survival, percent survival. If they don't survive, they never become adults. Okay, so it's also the adult abundance estimator. And you can see that in that high income, they had the lowest survival in albopictus, and they had the lowest survival of Culex, and that the regional was higher for both, but mostly for Culex. So we're starting to see some species differences, and she went on to look at competition, and Culex actually can compete with Aedes only in certain detrital habitats. But it kind of, it's not just that the numbers are different, the actual resources that are going into those numbers are coming from the trees, right? So we're getting differences in trees leading to differences in mosquitoes, which isn't necessarily where I thought I would end up. It also, it takes longer to get out if they don't have as many resources of that aquatic habitat. And that means there's a lot more time for things to dry up or somebody to go out and dump it. So faster tends to be better for mosquitoes in development time. And again, you can see that they get out much faster. They complete that juvenile life stage much more quickly in the low income and regional detritus. And remember that growing in a low income neighborhood means you're also exposed to regional detritus, right? Because it's across all of them. So we are seeing fundamental differences in the mosquito ecology based on the trees that happen to be growing in different neighborhoods. And I'll say this work, we're following up with Jane Lucas's lab to see what's going on with those detrital communities, and is it changing the microbiome? And I'm working hopefully soon with collaborators in New Orleans. We've been talking about going the next step. What does it mean for vector competence and fitness that they see these changes? Okay, so if we can go back to that conceptual model, we've got this vector system that's a little more complicated than I initially put up there. And socioeconomics is an important association of variation in this landscape. We don't really know what it is yet. But vegetation seems to be playing one role in filtering from socioeconomics back into the vector system. And we know that blood feeding has to be happening to connect the vector system for the host system, which is where we're going next. So this is what we all tend to care about and think about when we think about mosquitoes. They bite. It's terrible. Turns out not as bad as ticks, but and so this is work that we started to do. It is really hard to get these data. So you have to collect mosquitoes that have blood in their gut. The way we generally collect mosquitoes is luring them in to bite something. You put out CO2 or a lure. So we collect a ton of mosquitoes, and maybe 1% of them happen to have a blood meal. There are some ways, we were out with dustbusters and vacuuming for mosquitoes, like in more tropical areas where mosquitoes go indoors. People do all that in the house and vacuum mosquitoes. It turns out it's not as effective in vegetation outside Baltimore homes and abandoned lots. It was very hard. So we had to combine 3 years of data to get blood meal data. And Heather Goodman led this paper. And what you see here is those years of data compiled across the season of when we collected them. And this is the number of meals collected, and they're split up by what they came from. So you take that blood out of the mosquito gut and do a DNA analysis to see whose blood is it. Okay, and so in general, we found mosquitoes had one blood meal. at a time. We didn't find a lot of mixing of species. We found rats, humans, birds, and this other mammal category, which included deer, cats, and dogs. Okay, and this is Aedes albopictus, and this is Culex species, and this line here shows you the abundance during that same time period on average. So you can see that our blood meals tend to follow the abundance. You got more mosquitoes out there, you get more blood meals, but not entirely. I don't know what happens at the end in September. And rats make up a huge proportion of the blood meals in Aedes albopictus, and birds make up, as expected, a big part of the blood meals in Culex. Note that humans are in both, and there's no birds in Aedes albopictus, because we'll come back to those two things. Humans, this is the proportion of blood meals. Humans make up an increasing proportion of total blood meals, if you collapse that whole seasonality together, in your highest income neighborhoods. If they're not biting humans, they're biting rats. Those others were a very small proportion. So I think it's important to note that maybe these guys aren't getting bit as much. It may have something to do with the number of rats that the mosquito encounters before it encounters a human. This is also important to note that we found West Nile virus in albopictus, and we found no evidence of blood feeding from birds in albopictus. Okay, so given this and this, it's possible that rats are also a potential vertebrate host for West Nile virus. So I'm going to add the rats up here to suggest that maybe we don't know as much about the host system as we should. I'm still not going to get into that. And it looks like socioeconomic somehow affects blood feeding as well, which feeds back into the human biting. So we're going to drill down. So I've got a lot hanging on this idea of socioeconomics here, and I haven't really unpacked it at all. And I'm going to drill down for a few minutes into what we think might be going on. And a lot of this is through work with Don Beeler, as well as lots of discussion and learning with Stuart Pickett, and the Baltimore LTR in general. So this is a map of what's now famous Hulk security zones, which was established back before World War II to designate where banks should be lending for people to buy their homes. And they designated areas of cities across the nation as being in the hazardous, don't lend there, up to best categories for lending. And it happened to, as I'm sure everyone here knows, align very tightly with proportion Black or immigrant population in these zones. What it means is that in places that were red, people weren't allowed to buy their homes. There was no capacity for buying homes or accumulating wealth for a long time. What that looks like now is the deterioration of infrastructure in many areas. But I put this up here because both of the blocks I showed you earlier were originally in red line zones, right? So it is a seed that has started a terrible and racialized equity challenge, but it has been facilitated and reinforced along the way. And so you can imagine if you can't buy your home, you have lower tax base, the home values are lower, people move, you get less investment for externally coming into the neighborhood, you get population loss, your tax base gets, right? Like this is a typical vicious circle. And then you end up, so this is that same block I showed you earlier. This is a picture taken right here, right? You end up with these empty infrastructure. There's not investment to take them down, but clearly nobody's going to move in. But people do live down here, right? Like you can see people live here and people live here. So there are still people on these neighborhoods. Sometimes you get regrowth. So population loss leads to regrowth, and in fact, a lot of urban greening has really focused in on what do you do with the abandoned lots? You have population loss, let's get our tree canopy up to 30% by filling in those areas. And so you get lots of different types of urban greening. And you also get people moving in and investing in the community in new ways. And there could be a whole talk about the pros and cons of all of these things. And that's not where I'm going to go. What I am going to say is this economic system, that socioeconomics, is actually a system and not a thing. It's not this is a low-income neighborhood, this is a medium. There's a whole system going on there. And we've been working to try to unpack it in this context. But for now, I'm going to put it there because it gets pretty crazy to put it all in there. So we know that this is affecting infrastructure. We know it's affecting vegetation. But this outdoor culture idea is what I want to end on. So we also talked to people. And this was, originally I went in and I just wanted to get the mosquito data so I could model mosquitoes in the same way I'd kind of thought about birds. But it was really hard to get mosquito data. And I naively thought people were just going to let me in their yard to count mosquitoes and get mosquito data because nobody likes them. But it didn't work out that way, which was an absolute blessing because I started working with Don Beeler and we came up with this whole idea of really talking to people and understanding more about how they're interacting with their outdoor space and trying to think about how that influences the sustainability of greening efforts in their neighborhoods. And so we did these surveys. We went to every house, we knocked on doors, we talked to people, not me personally, because it turns out I'm terrible at giving a survey. But we asked people, do you spend time in the outdoor park or garden? All of these neighborhoods have an outdoor park and variations on community gardens. And what we found was that in these lower income neighborhoods that have a lot of abandonment, so if you're living next to this, people were, so this is abandonment. So this is our high income neighborhoods with very low abandonment. People, on average said, yeah, we spend time out in that garden and park. And that declined much more linearly than I expected as abandonment got high. So we did this at a block scale, not at the neighborhood scale. So on blocks that have really high abandonment, and these are 60%, right? So this high category ended up being about 40 to 60% abandoned buildings on the block. They're not using the green spaces, even though the green spaces are much more close to them. They are varying quality, but there are nice parks within walking distance of everybody we spoke with. So people aren't choosing to go outside as much into these shared spaces. When we ask those same people that don't use parks, where do you spend space? We heard the front stoop. There is a strong front stoop culture in Baltimore, and it is, it's strong even in neighborhoods where there's high abandonment. So you can't see, this is an abandoned building here that is missing windows and boarded up, right? But people live here, and the stoops are very active. We sampled for mosquitoes in these types of areas, and we never found them. Aedes albopictus in particular, I should say, only flies 50 to 100 meters. It's been documented like 200 meters, but the bulk of movement really isn't that far. And it's possible that a house is a good barrier. It's also probable that they don't need to go here. There's plenty where they're at to suffice their needs. But it does bring up the idea that there's a perhaps unintended protective behavior going on where by no means are people avoiding these spaces where we sampled for mosquitoes. This is Brian Becker, a 2012 REU student here, putting out a BG sentinel trap. People aren't avoiding these areas because of the mosquitoes necessarily. They're avoiding them for many other reasons. But it is effectively protecting them from exposure to the mosquitoes. So one of the things we saw early was that people in the neighborhoods that had the most mosquitoes complain the least about mosquitoes, right? They ranked them as not as problematic. They don't call in reports. And this may be part of that explanation. So what's the biggest environmental problem in your neighborhood? That was another question we asked. Again, we didn't want to tell people mosquitoes were a big problem. We wanted to find out what they thought big problems were. And you can see that, again, when you have low abandonment on the block, mosquitoes were a pretty big problem. Again, these are the people that want to be out in their parks and aren't concerned the building next door is falling over on them. As you become more concerned with other things associated with abandonment, mosquitoes really aren't that high on the radar of things to be concerned about. Trash is a huge problem. It's a huge problem. More than 30% of people said it in every block. Rats, nobody likes the rats. And vegetation was the surprise again. So when there's not a lot of abandonment, vegetation was mentioned occasionally as a problem. When you get more abandonment, vegetation is a pretty significant problem. It's recognized not as a benefit or amenity, it's recognized as a challenge and a potential safety issue. And I'm gonna touch on that in a second, but I want to point out that when you see these sorts of answers, they're also associated with interviews that suggest these people are less likely to report mosquito issues, even though they're on the blocks with the most mosquitoes. So what if they're not being bitten? Well, if we don't know where the mosquitoes are most abundant, control measures aren't very effective. Control in most cities, control doesn't exist in most parts of the US outside of cities. Cities or agencies where you do have control, it's often responsive to complaints. So again, there's a cycle there. And then vegetation, when you see this, you start to worry about this reduced support for new tree cover on blocks. And they're the same blocks that have the high opportunity to put in more tree cover. Increasingly we saw these are really valid concerns of what it means to be a tree when you've got high abandonment, and what it means for people to live near a tree when you've got high abandonment. And that's not to take anything away from the fact that if you covered in all that, if you actually put tree canopy in all that abandoned space, the entire city would benefit from it, right? And even locally, right, the temperatures would go down. This is not to take away from the fact that the trees are incredibly important, but they're doing more than just moderating temperature. And they're not doing it equitably across the entire neighborhood or city. And so again, just to reflect on some of people's comments about this vegetation, this is from a photo voice program that we did where we gave people cameras and told them to go out and take pictures of these environmental problems. And then Dawn Beeler, again, did interviews with the people. And so, her conclusion was that people they're not celebrating that nature's reclaiming the city. It's actually stressing them out because it's a constant reminder that the city, their neighborhoods have been abandoned and that they've lost community. And then the pictures tended to be, the things you would expect: trees growing out of buildings, trees breaking up sidewalks, and just this vegetation is just reclaiming this entire block, climbing up the building. Okay, so I've built up this very kind of complex structure, and I guess I didn't put it back in here to run. That outdoor cultural part is connected to the human system, and it's connected back into the vector system in ways that we don't quite understand yet, but must be important for understanding spillover. But if we go back, do we need all this complexity? Which I think is a fair question. It makes sense to think about habitat affecting abundance, and that abundance is a driver of human biting. And we know that human biting should trigger nuisance reporting, which goes back to control. And recording a nuisance should actually influence human action, okay? So that's what a lot of the public health messaging and public health campaigns for mosquito control are built on, right? Like, people care, and so they want to do something because they don't want to be bit. And we know that mosquitoes don't grow without habitat. So get rid of the juvenile habitat. It makes sense, right? And we even had our study showing that the more discarded habitat, the more mosquitoes you got in a block. So we thought that if we went out to a block, and we had 2 control blocks, 2 intervention blocks, and removed all of that habitat, and we filled a dumpster like this on each block. So thank you to Baltimore Public Works, Mary Holler, for getting us the dumpsters and picking them up. And we had an incredible team. It was terrible work, and I won't show pictures of it, but we removed habitat that we could remove. And so we had control blocks, and you can see the 4 mosquito traps. These are adult females. This is a week 1. Then we did our intervention where we removed all that habitat, and then we had 2 more weeks where we followed. So these were not our focal blocks. These were new blocks. And what you see here are the trap counts per trap night. And we only count females because nobody cares about the males. They don't bite. They are important pollinators, though. Okay, so we obviously hoped that removing all that garbage would reduce the mosquito populations on these blocks. And that's not what we found, right? It actually increased. We saw an increase in mosquito populations on some of the blocks, and actually 3 of the blocks by 2 weeks out had more mosquitoes than they did than the control blocks. And I'm not going to tell you why this happened because we don't know. We have lots of hypotheses. But it's possible that we removed a bunch of low-quality sink, right? It's possible that there's kind of an ecological trap sort of thing going on where when you have a bunch of garbage, mosquitoes spread their eggs out, and a bunch of them don't get out because that garbage dries up before they turn into adults. When you remove all that garbage, they focus back in on, things like whatever's going on in the abandoned buildings, and there's more permanent water. Just a hypothesis, we can't get in the abandoned buildings. We did repeat it the following year across a gradient of abandonment, and it was consistent with the idea that the abandoned buildings play some role in quality habitat for mosquitoes. And so if you're removing garbage in an area that's got quality habitat, these abandoned buildings, it's actually potentially has this emergent outcome, this surprise, of increasing the mosquito population. There are other hypotheses for what's going on there, and this is obviously an area of active research. But it's worth pointing out that public health messaging is not necessarily just, right? Like, the trash removal can have some really unintended consequences in the poorest neighborhoods where abandonment's high. Oh, I did put it all back together. So we kind of go back to the idea that all the different parts of this system are really important for understanding what changing one part might do in the future. And so that's important for things like how resilient is this system to changes in the season length or the temperature. We know that the seasons are getting longer, and so there's actually going to be more time for this blood feeding to happen. There's going to be longer time periods when you've got birds and mosquitoes coexisting, right? And that could go either way. That could mean that they don't need to switch over to feed on humans. Maybe there's enough birds. Similarly, what happens if you get rid of the rats? Not that anyone's ever going to. It's never been effective. But even at a block level, what happens when you get rid of the rats? What role are they playing in that system, and to what end? So I think the complexity is important. Without considering this kind of cascade of impacts, the possibility for prediction and management are really limited. That doesn't mean we can't and shouldn't try, but it gives me job security, so that's a good thing. And with that, thank you very much for being here. Okay, and so we are open for questions. We have 6 minutes, and then there will be, for those of you here, a lunch. I have provided a free lunch for the group. No, Matt has generously arranged for lunch afterwards. Sarah.
Thanks for a really awesome talk, Shannon. It's really awesome to see what you're working on. I'm curious more about the rats. So my memory is that you saw lower blood meals on rats in the higher income neighborhoods, but it looked like in terms of people talking about nuisance, there wasn't really a difference in the rat nuisance. So I'm wondering, are the abundances of rats the same across those neighborhoods? Or?
So we don't know, right? Everyone reports problems with rats. My exposure to rats was that I saw them more in some neighborhoods than others, for sure. And there's more resources for them. I think that the differences in the proportion of blood meals that the rats are making up is there's definitely more numbers of blood meals in that lower income, high abandonment category that are coming from rats, but there's also more mosquitoes there to begin with. But I think that the ratios become really important. So the mosquitoes are breeding on that back side, and even if you've got 40 people living in the homes, if they're not in that same space, they're not coming into contact with the mosquitoes. And so the mosquitoes are kind of getting more of their blood meals from rats. I suspect that the rat populations are higher because they also have more habitat, but I don't know that. Yeah. We've got Josh, Chris, Jane.
So Shannon, with the advent of climate change and dengue, Zika, malaria, all sort of working their way into the southern states. Do you think there's a generality of the results from this to apply to public health issues on these emerging infectious diseases?
Yeah, I think that the Aedes albopictus, which is kind of common in the more temperate area, has really similar characteristics to Aedes aegypti, which is increasing in population abundance in the southeast as it kind of moves back up. Climate and dengue and DDT resistance are allowing that, but it has very similar ecology. It is more efficient at the human component, and so dengue, Zika don't require that non-human vertebrate anymore. They all started that way, but they've evolved. Those viruses and vector associations have evolved so that they don't require the vertebrate hosts. Humans can reinfect them. And Aedes aegypti is a human specialist, and so in areas where Aedes aegypti is more dominant, that spillover isn't spillover, it's actually just epidemic. Open questions are the competition. They do both rely on similar habitat, Albopictus and aegypti. So when they line up, there's a lot of work trying to understand who wins in that situation. West Nile virus and the culex are still an important part of those communities as well. And there's actually several other things you can get from birds through mosquitoes as you move further south. And the culex species of import change, but they end up being functionally redundant. Yep. And then Chris.
Thanks, Shannon. It was really cool to see how you kind of worked through different pieces of that. And I was trying to put it back together in my head. And somehow the way I'm thinking about that, the question for you is like, so if you were going to build a new city today from scratch, and you wanted to design it to minimize the kind of spillover risk, but also to have all these other environmental amenities that you talked to someone about, like what would that look like? What's the right way to do that?
That's really hard. So I'm working with a group right now that we're hoping to get more funding to look at what does biodiversity in the city mean, and is there like a good biodiversity for human health that's maybe different from a good biodiversity for ecology? And so that's a hard question. I think we need to understand more about those kind of tritrophic interactions where, right, so if we build habitat in a forest in the city, what comes? Like, is just increasing biodiversity what we want, or is it, right, we know that the kind of lag from natural biodiversity, which tends to kind of moderate all nuisance populations in many ways, there's a lot of space from paved area to that, and you tend to get all of the things you don't necessarily want because they've already specialized on living close to humans first. And so I think figuring out how to get over that lag is important for thinking about how that moves forward, which is a non-answer. It's hard, I don't know. Yeah. Yep.
Thanks, Shannon, for an awesome talk. I am really curious, so, you mentioned that the predators are much lower in an urban system. And so I have kind of a two-part question. One is anyone trying to bring predators into an urban system, and how could we do it? And then similarly, when these like mosquito larvae are developing, is there anything else in that water that is competing? I know maybe the two species are competing, but anything else in there?
Yeah, so if we looked at stormwater pools, which are in many cities the only water that's above ground and managed, adding fish makes a huge difference, right? So culex populations are down even in small pools if there are fish present. The albopictus aren't ever going to be in open water of any sort, and so it's all about the containers. And so predators are potentially important in that if culex, or in other parts of the world, Anopheles, the malaria mosquito, are what you're most worried about. What we found was if we went and sampled near, a lot of that LTR sampling was near either restored stream sites or ponds. And the albopictus we found there were all in the trash that collected near them, or the tires that were near them. And no predators were in those. There is a mosquito larvae that eats other mosquito larvae called Toxorhynchides. It's a big one. And there have been programs to try to introduce that into more urban areas because it will live in container habitat, but they just can't. It doesn't spread out. You would have to introduce it into everybody everywhere. Yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky, the albopictus and the Aedes aegypti are very difficult for that reason. They've adapted to human living incredibly well and really benefited from it. Let me check this quickly. Okay, so I'm going to read one here from Kelvin. I'm curious if anyone has attempted to investigate if similar trends exist in other urbanizing regions outside of Baltimore. Do the patterns of localized mosquito abundance hold for other cities within the US? Yes, so there are definitely synthesis work that's come out recently, meta-analysis looking at the breadth of studies that think about socioeconomics and mosquitoes, showing that there are patterns. A lot of them are very generalizable. You know, even before we started doing this work, there was work in more of the subtropics looking at dengue and poverty. And a lot of that comes back to those container habitats. Where do container habitats collect, and where do they get managed effectively? So there are two sides to that. There's and actually my REU in 2012 and 13 found this. There was a really hot, dry year and then a wet year. And in the wet year, even in the parts of Baltimore that they look like, the mosquitoes were much more abundant in the low-income, kind of high abandonment areas. But in that really hot, dry year, the abundance shifted. So they were all less abundant, but the most abundant traps were all in the higher income areas. And people are really effective at decoupling environmental filters, right? And so generally if it's really dry, people are adding water. And if it's really wet, people are removing water. And so the places where people are managing all their containers in their yards were generally lower abundance. But if there's no precipitation, then they were where the abundance was being maintained. And so that connectivity actually was something that we had hoped to look into, but dispersal is really tricky. But yeah, so other studies have found both a positive association with socioeconomics and a negative association. In general, the meta-analyses suggest that there's a pretty generalizable trend that for Aedes mosquitoes that breed in these containers, poverty and garbage management are a huge driver of greater risk and abundance. So one more, Vanessa.
Thank you for your talk. And what is your opinion if they genetically modify mosquitoes, and how do you think this could be applied for Baltimore, for example?
Say it one more time. I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Oh, sorry.
You.
What is your opinion in the genetically modified mosquitoes?
Oh, right. Okay.
How do you think that could be in your work?
So that's a big question. I'm noticing the time. So a quick answer, and I'd be happy to talk more with you about it, is that introducing mosquitoes that have been genetically modified, there's a whole bunch of different ways that people have tried to do that. And there's a lot of evidence that in some places where the population boundaries are well known, that they're trying to treat, it can be very effective. It would be very difficult to release enough modified, generally male mosquitoes to swamp a city and actually be impactful. But a block, it could be. Again, they don't fly all that far, so if you can imagine you're going to try to swamp out the natural genetics, you really have to release enough that a small proportion that go further than 100 meters make a difference. So. Great. Well, so with that, let's go have lunch. Thank you.